All right, this is our second lesson on the Crucible. This is part two of a two-part series. And in this lesson, I want to connect some of the contextual and allegorical parts of the play that I talked about in part one to the background of the play itself. I want to give you a brief overview of the Dramatis Personae, right, the characters in the play. And that'll get us ready to start reading. Right, so there is a backstory to this play. In fact, the play opens en media res, right, this fancy English teacher way of saying in the middle of the action. That's a vocab term you should know. And the backstory is told almost completely by the narrator in the introduction, which is very strange and very different. I'm going to talk about why this is in a moment. And sometimes this narrator is referred to as Arthur Miller for reasons that I want to explore in the next few slides as well. And we're also going to see this narrator break in throughout the first scene. So the backstory in this play is handled very differently from backstories that you may be used to and you may have seen in other things that you've read in your high school English classes. Right? Because the narrator has a very different role in American plays in the 20th century, right? You're probably used to reading Shakespeare's plays if you're an American high school student. If you're a junior, then it's likely that you've read a couple of Shakespeare's plays, maybe Romeo and Juliet, one of them. Right? And Shakespeare's plays and those of his contemporaries weren't meant to be read on the page like novels. They were meant to be seen, and so when you get Shakespeare's plays, there's never a narrator, there's almost no stage direction. These 20th century American plays like The Crucible or Miller's Death of a Salesman or maybe A Streetcar Named Desire by Tennessee Williams, these are very widely read 20th century American plays in American high schools and colleges. These plays very often have narrators that make them readable like novels, to where you can actually just kind of sit and pick up the script of the play and just read it like you'd read a book. Again, very different from older, forms of drama. And you're going to see here that in this play, the narrator has a very editorializing tone, can be very preachy at times, to the point where readers often wonder if the narrator is supposed to be Arthur Miller himself. In fact, you're going to see that the narrator gives rationales and explanations that hint at the playwright's inspiration and craft. The kind of behind-the-scenes writing that only a playwright or an author or a director would give. And so again, this makes us wonder if this is supposed to be Miller, even though he's not necessarily explicitly referred to as such within the text of the play. And we're going to see, too, that this narrator will kind of have some stop action sequences, and the narrator will break in throughout the first scene and give us descriptions of the characters and setting and context. Kind of funny, too, because some of the things the narrator is going to say can also be inferred from the characters' dialogues in the same way we often have to make those inferences when we're reading Shakespeare. And so you'll see that this narrator has a presence that's closer to that of a character within the play, kind of similar to the Greek chorus and choragus. If you're used to reading classical Greek plays like Oedipus Rex or Antigone, you may see some similarities there. You'll also see that this narrator is going to provide much heavier stage direction and setting detail than the plays of the classical and Renaissance periods. Again, the text of the play, as you're going to see in class, reads much more like a novel than it does the script of a play, especially at the beginning when the narrator is so much more present than he or she will be later in the play. All right, so let's look at the characters themselves. And it's important to note that all of the characters are based on real historical people, either as one-to-one representations or sometimes as composites, in which Miller takes more than one real person and kind of rolls them together. But this, as I've said in part one, this is a surprisingly historically accurate play. It can almost be used as a textbook for this historical moment, even though it is a work of dramatic fiction or historical fiction and a work of art. All right, so the first character I want to look at is Samuel Parris. He's the reverend of the church. He's a very powerful member of the community, but he's threatened by certain factions, and so because of that, he's very nervous, and he's a very political figure. He doesn't necessarily always do what's right, but he always does what's political. And his daughter, Betty Paris, is supposedly under the influence of witchcraft at the beginning of the play as she lays there on stage, either comatose or faking being in a coma. And then there's also Abigail Williams, who's this orphan that Samuel Parris has taken in. Now, she's one of the characters that Miller alters for dramatic purposes. He changes her age and changes a few details about her to make her more of the antagonist and more of a compelling figure in the play. We're also going to meet Thomas and Ann Putnam and their daughter Ruth. Thomas and Ann are the heads of a very wealthy family whose daughter has supposedly been bewitched. We learn also that they've lost numerous children shortly after their births, so they're a very scarred and emotionally damaged family. We can somewhat sympathize with them, even though they're going to be, with Abigail Williams, the principal antagonists in the play, and they're very ruthless and ambitious, and they're also very scared people, so they're also hard characters to like, even though we can sympathize with them a little bit. We're also going to meet Rebecca and John Nurse. These are rags to riches members of the colony who are very widely respected and even revered in the community, but they are threats to some of their neighbors, and they've been very successful. So, those at the top, view them as threats to their position and standing within the community. We're also going to meet John and Elizabeth Proctor. They're kind of a reclusive couple. They live a little bit outside of the village. They're highly respected for their values and morals, but they've recently fired Abigail Williams, and this is going to create some problems within the community and turn Abigail into a vengeful character. John Proctor is the other character who is altered by Miller to suit the drama. He's, I believe, made a little bit younger and more handsome, and so he's a little bit different than the historical record. But he will emerge as the protagonist and hero of this play. We're also going to meet Tituba and Giles Corey. Tituba is the Paris' slave, and she's from Barbados, but of African descent. And she's involved in the so-called witchcraft, and it's unclear whether she's been practicing witchcraft or voodoo or some kind of West African spirituality, but she is at the center of this witchcraft drama. And then there's Giles Corey, who's a contentious old member of the village. He's an honest man. He's very harmless and brave and loyal, but he represents the honest people who stand up to negative authority and the abuses of power and who end up suffering for it. We're also going to meet the Reverend Hale of Beverly, who comes in as a so-called expert in witchcraft to try to uncover the truth. He has a belief in his understanding of witchcraft that borders on our belief in science, and I think Miller is playing around with that. Also, we're going to meet the judges Hawthorne and Danforth, who are civil judges who preside over a court that's been tasked with examining supernatural and religious affairs. And they show us the kind of theocratic nature of some of the early colonies like Massachusetts Bay and the Mayflower Compact colony at Plymouth. Over time, especially Danforth will take over the role of antagonist in this play as he comes to believe that he has the power to stop this so-called witchcraft. We're also going to meet some of the girls like Mercy Lewis and Mary Warren, who are servant girls in the community and part of Abigail's plot. They're kind of her henchmen. And as you're going to see, Abigail's one of these, I guess what we now call a mean girl who has these bullied girls that are a part of her circle and who do her bidding in many ways. So some final notes here. I want to just look at some thematic considerations and give you some things to think about as we read the play. So I want you to think about hysteria and how it can tear a community apart, and how the creation of fear and hysteria can be used to suppress dissent within a community and keep people in line. It's one way to get citizens and the underclass to behave themselves is to make them afraid. Also, we want to look at the urge to confess to save oneself. Very often we can sell out others to gain favor or safety from those who are in power. And I think Miller is thinking about that both in his confrontation with McCarthy and in his examination of the history itself. And finally, we want to think about the theme of sacrificing oneself to protect one's honor, right? What's more important, one's life or one's reputation and good name? And Miller is thinking about that as well. And so that's it. Thanks for watching.